Hello everyone! This guide focuses on custom monster skills in Miliastra Wonderland. You will learn what complex creations are and how they differ from basic creations, how to create custom monster skills, and how to build a creation status decision node graph that influences your monster's logic and decision making. Additionally, I will show you two examples of complex creations I've made. Complex creations are a new addition to Miliastra Wonderland, introduced in version Luna 4. At first glance, they may seem identical to basic creations, but they are much more intriguing. It's worth noting that at the time of making this video, only 7 different complex creations are available in the Miliastra Wonderland. Let's now go over all the minor and major differences between basic and complex creations. The first thing you may notice is that zoom adjustment rate slider on the Transform tab. You can use it to adjust the size of your complex creation. You can make it half as big, or 3 times as big, or anything in between. You will be also able to change the preset status in the Model tab. This setting affects various aspects of a complex creation, including its initial actions. This option is available only for a few select creations. That's it for the minor differences. Things get much more interesting when we click on the second tab. Standard Settings tab, visible in Basic Creations, is replaced by 4 other tabs in Complex Creations: Creation Skill Management, Autonomous Logic Parameter Settings, Creation Status Decision Node Graph, and Optional Patrol Settings. All these settings work in tandem to define a monster custom logic and decision making. I will now briefly explain each one, and later I will show you step by step how to configure everything. Let's start with Creation Skill Management. If you want your creation to use custom skills, you'll need to define them here. Making a custom skill for your creation is very similar to creating one for players. I covered this in my previous tutorial under local projectiles, but of course I'll go over it again later in this guide. Creation's custom skill is subject to 3 different cooldown timers: global skill cooldown, and skill group cooldown. A skill can only be used when all these timers are ready. You can also set the initial cooldown to trigger either when the creation enters battle or when it exits it. Initial cooldown means that after the creation is summoned, it will start using the skill only once the set time has passed. You can assign a range of values if you want the cooldown to be random, or input the same number twice if you want it fixed time. Default cooldown is the actual cooldown time. After the creation uses the skill, it cannot use it again until the specified time has passed. If a skill is configured with a cooldown group, it can only be used when its skill cooldown, global skill cooldown, and skill group cooldown have all reset. If you select when skill ends under cooldown trigger timing, the cooldown will begin counting after the skill finishes. Alternatively, you can start counting when the skill begins by selecting when skill starts. You can check trigger skill global cooldown if you want your skill to affect the global skill cooldown. The last option is fairly self-explanatory. Ignore global skill cooldown removes the global skill cooldown restriction from the skill's usage conditions. In the second tab, you can adjust the global cooldown and add cooldown groups as needed by clicking Add Cooldown Group. These groups link the cooldown timers of multiple skills. Next, we have Autonomous Logic Parameter Settings. These settings are quite similar to the basic creation's combat settings. First, you'll need to create a template by clicking the plus button. Remember that each template has its own ID. This will be useful later. If you want your template to take effect immediately when the complex creation is spawned, select Initially Effective. Then, decide whether you want your creation to enter battle based on FOV detection, range detection, or both. You can preview the ranges of both options, allowing you to fine-tune the distances as needed. Chain engagement distance determines how far other creations can be before they also join the fight once this creation enters combat. Leaving battle distance defines how far the creation can move from its target before leaving combat. Pathfinding failed leaving battle means that if no valid path exists between a creation in combat and its target, it will leave battle. You can also set a delay for this action. Territory defines the area within which a creation's movement is restricted. Player leaves battle after leaving the area is fairly self-explanatory. When enabled, the creation ends combat once its target leaves the specified area. Finally, we have the creation status decision node graph. This is essentially the brain of the creation. Here you configure its logic and decision making using two special nodes. The event node execute only by sequence, and the execution node switch to self-execution status. The decision node graph operates continuously in the background, constantly evaluating and executing available statuses. More on this later. For now, let's move on to creating skills for your creations. As I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to showcase how to create complex creation skills using two examples. The first one will be my complex ruin guard, whose creation status decision node graph makes him patrol while he's not using any skills. Perform a ranged attack when the target player is more than 5 meters away, and perform a melee attack when the target player is closer than 5 meters. I will now show you how to build this step by step. First, go to Prefab Library, Creation Prefabs, Complex Creation, Automatons and select Ruin Guard. Feel free to adjust the zoom value to make it smaller or larger. I left it at the default. Next, go to the second tab and click Edit Details under Autonomous Logic Parameter Settings. Add a template and set it to initially effective. You can set all values here to your liking. I chose both range perception and FOV detection, set their distance to 20, set living battle distance to 10 and territory to 50. After creating a template, start working on the skill. Go to Combat Preset, Local Projectile, and click Plus New Projectile. Select Empty Object and disable Native Collision. Then go to the second tab and select a VFX. Normally, you would want your projectile to be visible, but in this case, I do not want it to be visible because I want it to look like the Ruin Guard's hands are causing the explosion. So select any VFX and set its zoom value to 0. Set the projectile type in Projectile Motion Device to Linear Projectile and leave the speed unchanged, since it does not matter here. Then click on Advanced Editing under On-Hit Detection, set the detection delay time to 0, and change the on-hit area to a sphere with a radius of 4 in the next tab. Next, go to the third tab and add an ability unit. Make it a hitbox attack. Again set the hitbox to a sphere with a radius of 4. Set the damage coefficient and increment to your liking, in my case 501 respectively, and add some VFX to the explosion the Ruin Guard creates with its hands. I chose red explosion dust. Then add that ability in on-hit trigger settings under Execute Ability Unit when hit. Now you need to open Beyond Editor for the first time in this guide. Every node graph in this guide will be a client node graph, so select Window, Client Node Graph Resource Explorer, and under Creation Skill Node Graph, right-click and select Create Node Graph. This is just a simple local projectile that uses the execution node fixed point projectile launch, where projectile's prefab ID is the prefab ID of the projectile we just created. If you want to learn more about local projectiles, please refer to my other in-depth video guide. The next step is to go to the Skill tab, Creation Custom Skill, and click Plus Skill. Change the Creation Skill primary model to Ruin Guard and click Confirm Create. You will almost always want to have automatically face target enabled. For the other options, you will need to decide based on your needs. Next, click on Animation Editor and select Ruin Guard Melee Attack 02. The full animation is quite long, so I recommend setting the duration to 2.5 seconds by clicking the animation duration and entering your desired value. Then you need to insert the node graph you created into the correct timing window in the animation, and using the blue flag can help with that. Since the projectile is invisible, you may want to add some VFX to the animation itself by clicking Add Event on the status track at the right moment. I added 2 VFX attached to the Ruin Guard's right hand. After that, go back to the prefab library, select your Ruin Guard, and add a skill under Creation Skill Management. You can set the cooldowns mentioned earlier however you like. I did not use an initial cooldown and set the default cooldown between 3 and 5 seconds. That is it for the melee skill, so now let us create the ranged one. This process is very similar, with the key difference that we want this ranged projectile to be visible. If you do not want your projectile to disappear after a set amount of time, you can select Permanent in Life Cycle settings. You can also set component axis destruction distance to 50 or more if you want your projectile to disappear after traveling that distance. Projectile type can be either linear or tracking. I chose a tracking projectile with a tracking angular velocity of 20 degrees per second. This makes the monster's projectiles a bit harder to dodge than if they only travel in a straight line. Set your desired speed, acceleration, and acceleration duration, and remember to create another ability unit and insert it into the on-hit trigger settings window under Execute Ability Unit when hit. After you finish, copy the prefab ID of your projectile again and create another node graph in the same place as before. This node graph is almost identical to the one I showed you before. The first difference is, of course, the different prefab ID in the execution node fixed point projectile launch. The second difference is that get entity location is now connected to 3D vector addition instead of directly to create location in fixed point projectile launch. This makes the projectile appear slightly higher, which looks better visually. The last difference is an additional query node, get creation's current target, since my projectile type is a tracking projectile. If you chose a linear projectile, you do not need to include this node. Once again, go to the Skill tab and create another skill under Creation Custom Skill. Configure the options in General Settings as you like, and then open the animation editor. I chose the Ruin Guard Melee Attack 04 postcast animation and shortened it to 1.7 seconds. Then inserted the node graph we just created 5 times at roughly equal intervals. This will cause the Ruin Guard to spawn 5 projectiles over the course of the animation. You can optionally add some VFX again if you like. Next, return to the prefab library, select your complex Ruin Guard, and add another skill. Then set your desired cooldowns as before. Your creation now has 2 fully functional skills, but it still will not use them because it does not yet know when to do so. We can change that by creating a creation status decision node graph. Open Beyond Editor and, under Creation Status Decision Node Graph, right-click and select Create Node Graph. This is the brain of our creation. This node graph runs continuously in the background and tells it what to do and when to do it. You may notice that the only available event node here is Execute Only by Sequence, and the only available execution node is Switch to Self-Execution Status. The Execute Only by Sequence node does exactly what its name suggests. It first tries to execute the node connected to the first execution pin. If that execution fails, it then tries to execute the node connected to the failed execution pin, if there is one, and if that also fails, it moves on to the node connected to the second execution pin, and so on. Each switch to self-execution status node must have one creation status node attached to it, so let us create a few of them now. Create a new node graph under Creation Status Node Graph. This is the piece of logic that tells our creation which specific skill to use, as defined by its skill ID. If you followed my guide, then the melee skill will have skill ID 1 and the ranged skill will have skill ID 2. For now, simply connect Execute Only by Sequence to Execute skill and select the appropriate skill ID. Since my Ruin Guard has 2 skills, we need to create another Creation Status Node Graph that is nearly identical to the first one. You only need to change the skill ID from 1 to 2. The last Creation Status Node Graph will tell our Ruin Guard to patrol the area, or, more specifically in this case, to roam around. Since this is not a skill, we need to use another tool at our disposal, a tactic. In this case, tactic ground idle roaming. If you want to configure a specific patrol template for your creation, you can instead use tactic execute patrol. You can set the creation speed to walk or run and choose the idle roaming radius, roaming interval, and roaming distance. Tactical context can be used, for example, when you are using the query node get previous frame execution tactic, but most of the time you can leave it empty. Finally, choose whether you want this tactic to be interruptible or not. We now have all the tools we need to finish our creation status decision node graph, so let us take another look at it. My sequence of execution is as follows: patrol, execute skill 2, and execute skill 1. So the status node graph configuration ID in the switch to self-execution status node connected to pin 1 in execute only by sequence must be taken from creation status patrol, pin 1, execute skill 2, pin 2, and execute skill 1, pin 3. If you followed my guide and created only one autonomous logic template, then simply set the autonomous logic parameter ID to 1 everywhere. Now we need to answer the question, when do we want our creation to execute these skills and tactics? As you can see in my example, I want my ruin guard to roam around when two conditions are met. 1. It is currently not in battle, and 2. It is currently not using a skill. For the ranged skill, I want my creation to use it when two other conditions are met. 1. The aggro target, in this case the player, is on the field, and 2. The distance between the creation and the target is greater than 5 meters. Finally, when the aggro target is on the field and the distance between the creation and the target is less than or equal to 5 meters, I want my ruin guard to use its melee skill. After finishing, save your node graph and remember to insert it into your creation in the Creation Status Decision Node Graph tab. That is it for the first example. Let us look at the second one. My second example is a complex pyro hilichurl shooter who shoots from afar and runs away when someone gets close, then turns around to seek a new target. Much of the configuration will be very similar to my complex ruin guard, so I will focus on the key differences. First, I made it slightly larger by using the zoom adjustment rate and setting its value to 2. Complex pyro hilichurl shooters do not have a visible weapon by default, so I added one using decorations. Both of these steps are optional, but I wanted to showcase them. Once again, create an autonomous logic parameter template. The key difference is that I made the range perception and FOV detection radius much larger, since it is supposed to shoot from afar. Then create another projectile by going to the local projectile tab and clicking plus new projectile. The settings here are almost the same as the ranged ruin guards projectile. I chose 3 different VFX that you can see on screen. Remember that you can always preview how your combination of VFX looks by clicking Preview Combination. Again, I chose Tracking Projectile as the projectile type, but with a slower tracking angular velocity this time. Finish configuring your ability unit and on-hit detection, and once again go to Beyond Editor to create a simple node graph under Creation Skill Node Graph. Not much to add here. The node graph is identical to the one we made earlier, and 3D vector addition is optional, but will make your projectile start from a more natural position. Now go to the Skill tab, add a new skill, and remember to change Creation Skill Primary Model to Pyro Hilichurl Shooter this time. Open the animation editor. You can add multiple animations to your timeline here. For this example, I used one Pyro Hilichurl shooter aim, followed by 3 Pyro Hilichurl shooter range attack 01, each shortened to 0.6 seconds. I inserted our newly created node graph at the beginning of each shooting animation. You can of course keep experimenting with it and add your own projectiles or VFX. After you finish, remember to define your skill in the Creation Skill Management tab on your creation and set your desired cooldowns. Once again, go back to Beyond Editor and create 2 additional tactics: Tactic Ground Escape and Tactic Rotate by Specified Angle. Another simple graph. Connect the previously mentioned tactics to the Execute Only by Sequence node, with the first execution pin connected to Tactic Ground Escape and the second to Tactic Rotate by Specified Angle. I set escape trigger distance to 15 meters, movement speed to run, and maximum escape angle to 90 degrees. You can also adjust escape segments and distance, set your desired escape trigger cooldown, and configure the time after which the aggro is cleared. For the rotation, I set it to 180 degrees at an angular velocity of 90 degrees per second. After configuring your tactics, create one last node graph in this guide, the Creation Status Decision node graph for the Hilichurl. Since we combined 2 tactics into one node graph earlier, this one will look a little simpler, with only 2 switch to self-execution status nodes. The first execution pin leads to our runaway and turnaround tactics, and the second execution pin connects to the Execute Skill 1 node graph we made earlier for the complex ruin guard. As for the logic, I want my Hilichurl to run away when 2 conditions are met. 1. It is currently in battle, and 2. The distance between it and the target is less than 15 meters. I want it to shoot when it's currently in battle, and the distance between it and the target is greater than 15 meters. That's it. Remember to save your node graph and place it on your creation under the Creation Status Decision Node Graph tab. There are many more tactics available for you to experiment with, and I encourage you to do so, since this update was really fun and I enjoyed trying new things. I hope you learned something from this guide. Thank you for watching.